two topics we're going to talk about in the renal system is the regulation of plasma volume and the regulation of plasma osmolarity by the kidneys. So the kidneys play a really key role in the long-term regulation of plasma volume, which I told you in the cardiovascular section that long-term regulation of plasma volume is how we actually also regulate blood pressure, right, on a long-term basis. And then also the regulation of plasma osmolarity is a key function of the kidneys. So these two systems, regulating plasma volume and plasma osmolarity, they are interconnected, but we're going to treat them as two separate systems because they really are two separate systems that intersect in important ways. Okay. So when we talk about regulating plasma volume, we're also really regulating extracellular fluid volume. Okay? This is really the regulation of ECF volume, and it's a way to help maintain blood pressure. The way that we regulate the volume of extracellular fluid is by regulating the sodium content of our body. Okay? Because water follows sodium, any retention of sodium expands volume, okay? And any depletion of sodium causes a loss in volume. Okay? So we regulate extracellular fluid volume by regulating sodium balance. That's very important to keep in mind. Okay? So what are we talking about in terms of sodium balance? Whenever we talk about a balance of anything, we're talking about balancing the gains and the losses, okay, so that we can maintain a constant pool of sodium. So what are the sources of sodium gains and what are the sources of sodium losses? We gain sodium, it's very simple, we gain sodium through the sodium that we ingest and absorb through the GI tract. Okay? The sodium that is basically in the food and the fluids that we take in and absorb through our GI tract. We lose sodium either through renal excretion, okay, the sodium that's in our urine and we excrete, or we've got non-renal losses of sodium. Okay? And that is through things like sweat and feces. Normally the non-renal loss of sodium is minimal, okay, compared to the renal loss of sodium. However, under conditions like diarrheal states or profuse sweating, non-renal losses of sodium can become significant. Okay? But under normal circumstances, the renal excretion of sodium is our main mechanism for sodium loss. So, to maintain sodium balance, we want to maintain an equal relationship between the oral intake of sodium and the renal and non-renal sodium losses. Okay? And since the renal losses are more significant, we're going to focus our attention on the renal losses. So we are going to regulate extracellular fluid volume by regulating the losses of the renal losses of sodium. That's where we're going to get to. So every system has to start with sensation, right? We have to be able to have sensors that monitor the regulated variable, right? Being sodium. Now the way that we regulate sodium or sense sodium is by sensing plasma volume through the regulation of blood pressure. Okay? So the idea is by monitoring blood pressure in a long-term way, it's actually an indirect measure of our sodium balance because a change in sodium affects plasma volume, which is going to affect blood pressure. Okay? So we already talked about our baroreceptors, right? We talked about the baroreceptors that are responsible for short-term regulation of blood pressure. And those were the aortic arch baroreceptors and the carotid sinus baroreceptors. Now, there's a third set of baroreceptors in our kidney, the renal baroreceptors. Now, these are baroreceptors, unlike the aortic arch and the carotid sinus, that do not adapt to persistent change in blood pressure. Okay? They are responsible for monitoring blood pressure in a long-term way. So these receptors don't adapt. So where are our renal baroreceptors? The renal baroreceptors are at this specialized area of the kidneys that we spoke about before, this juxtaglomerular apparatus. Okay? The renal baroreceptors are the granular cells at the juxtaglomerular apparatus. Those granular cells can sense the pressure in that afferent arteriole and can sense any change in systemic arterial blood pressure. And as I said, they don't adapt. Okay? They don't adapt. When, for example, there is a decrease in plasma volume, it's going to cause a decrease in blood pressure, and that's going to be sensed by the juxtaglomerular apparatus granular cell baroreceptors. It's going to be sensed by those renal baroreceptors. When these baroreceptors sense a drop in blood pressure, they release a substance called renin. They release that substance into the bloodstream. So renin enters the bloodstream, and renin actually is an enzyme. It's responsible for converting a prohormone called angiotensinogen into another hormone, still a pre-hormone, called angiotensin 1. Okay? Angiotensinogen is a peptide hormone, a peptide prohormone produced by the liver. It's converted by renin in the bloodstream. Okay, angiotensinogen is found in the bloodstream. When renin enters the blood, angiotensinogen is converted into angiotensin 1, which circulates in the body. And when angiotensin 1 enters organs like the lungs that have a high deposition of an enzyme called ACE, right, otherwise known as angiotensin converting enzyme, ACE. When angiotensin 1 interacts with ACE, it's converted into the active hormone called angiotensin 2. Okay? So the release of renin promotes the ultimate formation of angiotensin 2. Angiotensin 2 is a very powerful hormone. It acts in several very important ways to increase plasma volume and increase sodium content. Okay? And it's all directed at recovering plasma volume, recovering blood pressure. So what are the actions of angiotensin 2? What are the actions of angiotensin 2 that are going to increase blood pressure, increase plasma volume? Number 1, angiotensin 2 acts on the adrenal cortex. Okay? It acts on the adrenal cortex, and it stimulates the production of the mineralocorticoid aldosterone. Aldosterone, we talked about this earlier, acts on the distal tubule and the collecting duct, and it increases the reabsorption of sodium. Okay? The reabsorption of sodium promotes the passive reabsorption of water, right? Water follows sodium. So you get this aldosterone-induced retention of sodium and water, and that promotes an expansion of plasma volume. The second action of the angiotensin 2. Angiotensin 2 is a potent vasoconstrictor. So among other vessels, the angiotensin 2 constricts the afferent arteriole of the nephrons in the kidney. That's going to reduce capillary blood pressure and GFR. And by reducing GFR, we limit our urinary production, and so we minimize fluid loss. Okay. So angiotensin vasoconstricts renal blood vessels like the afferent arteriole, which reduces GFR. Angiotensin II also directly vasoconstricts systemic arteries and arterioles, which is going to elevate blood pressure. Angiotensin II also enhances the tubuloglomerular feedback system. If you remember, this was the system that auto-regulates GFR, so that if there happens to be a momentary rise in GFR, the kidneys bring it back down. Now, angiotensin II's effect on the tubuloglomerular system is to actually trick this autoregulation system into thinking that GFR has gotten too high. So angiotensin II tricks this system, enhances the sensitivity, so that the net effect is a drop in GFR. Okay? So drops GFR through that tubuloglomerular system. Fourth function of angiotensin II. It directly stimulates sodium reabsorption through the mechanism that's coupled to hydrogen ion secretion. Okay? So it directly stimulates sodium reabsorption through the mechanism that's coupled to hydrogen ion secretion. So angiotensin II stimulates the reabsorption of sodium and the simultaneous secretion of hydrogen ions. Okay? And so in that way we get a net increase in sodium reabsorption directly. Okay, so angiotensin II is enhancing sodium reabsorption directly through this mechanism and indirectly through aldosterone. Keep that in mind. 5. Angiotensin II acts on the hypothalamus, and it stimulates the sensation of thirst, so we consume more fluid, and it stimulates the release of antidiuretic hormone, so we retain more water. Okay? So angiotensin II stimulates thirst, and it stimulates the release of antidiuretic hormone, bringing about water retention. Okay? So summary of the actions of angiotensin II. We're going to categorize it into 3 different categories. First category is increased sodium reabsorption, right? And then whenever we increase sodium reabsorption, we get subsequent water reabsorption. So increased sodium reabsorption through the stimulation of aldosterone release and the stimulation of the sodium hydrogen ion exchanger. Second category is decreasing GFR, right, which minimizes urine production and fluid loss. Angiotensin II decreases GFR by direct vasoconstriction of the afferent arterioles and by enhancing or tricking, right, that tubuloglomerular feedback system. Last category is increased water consumption by stimulating thirst and water retention or reabsorption through the release of ADH. Okay, so you can see angiotensin II is doing many things in order to recover or conserve plasma volume and elevate blood pressure. Now, our other baroreceptors that we talked about earlier, the short-term baroreceptors, aortic arch carotid sinus, they also play a role here. Okay? They also play a role. These carotid sinus and aortic arch baroreceptors are going to actually get the ball rolling on this system, right? Because they are very sensitive to the onset of a change in blood pressure. Okay? So we've been talking about a drop in blood pressure. When blood pressure drops, the carotid and aortic arch baroreceptors sense the onset of that drop. So it senses the drop when it first happens. And when it senses that, it increases sympathetic activity to the body, including the sympathetic activity to the kidneys. So when our aortic arch and carotid sinus baroreceptors sense a drop in blood pressure, they increase sympathetic activity to the kidneys, which is going to constrict the afferent arteriole and decrease GFR. Okay, so the sympathetic nerves to the kidneys innervate the afferent arteriole, and it causes it to constrict and decrease GFR. And the sympathetic nerves also innervate the juxtaglomerular apparatus. So it's also going to stimulate the release of renin, right? And that release of renin is going to initially increase the production of angiotensin II. Okay. And the last thing that increased sympathetic activity is going to do is that it's going to also increase the release of antidiuretic hormone. So if we look at this in one total thing, okay, we've got the decrease in plasma volume causing a decrease in blood pressure. It's going to be sensed by both sets of baroreceptors, the aortic arch and carotid sinus baroreceptors and the renal baroreceptors. The aortic arch and carotid sinus baroreceptors are going to be very sensitive to when the blood pressure first drops. Okay? And when they sense that first drop, they're going to increase sympathetic stimulation to the afferent arteriole and decrease GFR. They're going to stimulate those granular cells to release renin, and that's going to lead to a production of angiotensin II. Right? It's also going to increase the release of ADH and cause water reabsorption. But remember, these aortic and carotid baroreceptors, they adapt after a few minutes. Okay? So you only get a few minutes of this increased sympathetic nerve activity with a sustained decrease in blood pressure. Okay? But that's just enough to get this ball rolling, because the renal baroreceptors then take over. Okay? They are also sensing the decrease in blood pressure, and they're going to continue to release renin, which is going to continue to lead to a production of angiotensin II. And angiotensin II is going to act in all the ways that we mentioned, right, to recover blood volume and blood pressure. It's going to enhance aldosterone production, and which increases sodium reabsorption in the distal tubule and the collecting duct. Angiotensin II is going to directly stimulate those sodium-hydrogen exchangers, which is going to increase sodium reabsorption in the proximal tubule. Angiotensin II is going to directly constrict the afferent arteriole, which is going to decrease GFR. It's going to enhance that tubuloglomerular feedback system, which further decreases GFR. It's going to stimulate thirst, increase water consumption. It's going to stimulate ADH, increase water retention. And finally, but not minimally, angiotensin II is also a potent vasoconstrictor of systemic arteries and arterioles, which is going to help increase blood pressure. Okay? So it's this system that's responsible for the long-term control of plasma volume and therefore the long-term control of blood pressure. We call this system the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. Okay? The renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. And so this is a really important system, and it's something that you really want to make sure you fully understand.